I thought we'd better get started. My name is Roberta Sonnino with Professor Kevin Morgan. We are both from the School of Planning and Geography here at Cardiff University. I was awarded an Outstanding Impact Prize by the ESRC in 2013 for the public policy impacts of our research on school food of all topics, as we will explain in a second. So I'm not going to obviously talk that much about the research per se in itself, but about this process of developing pathways to research impact, which is the title of this presentation. It's also the title of a very important document without which, as an academic, you won't even be able to submit a bid to the ESRC. So nowadays, any type of request for funding goes in with attached this document called Pathways to Research Impact. Your sponsor wants to know, before allocating money, what kind of plans do you have in mind to make sure that our academic research has policy and societal relevance? Well, we'll talk about this in what is hopefully going to be an interactive session in which I want to address these four key questions. First of all, about whether or not having an impact for us as academics really has value. Who are the non-academic beneficiaries, or end users, as ESRC likes to call them, of our research? What kind of impacts can we actually achieve through our research, and through what type of mechanisms? Now, I will be raising these questions with you. Obviously, there are way too many people in the room to have a real group discussion, but what I would like you all to do is to discuss these issues when they come up, when I'll tell you to do it, with your neighbors, and then report back a few sound bites, 3, 4 things that come to your mind in relation to these questions when I will raise them. So let me start by saying that this impact agenda is very much at the heart of the ESRC funding strategy, but as an international academic with lots of international experience, I can tell you that there's no funding body in the world at the moment that doesn't value impact, and your strategy, your plans to make sure that there's not just a dissemination of your findings outside of academia, but actually a type of research that, as I said, has some kind of impact outside of the academic world. And needless to say, some academics have been reacting to this issue, to this impact agenda. The main argument behind this emerging literature is that when the impact agenda becomes instrumentally significant, when we as social scientists are placed in the position of having to produce impacts, and these impacts are then judged and evaluated based on an auditing metric, well, there can be unintended consequences, essentially the commodification of academic research. One of the most powerful recent books on this topic, and obviously this is a great critic of the impact agenda, is Stefan Collini. This is a book published in 2012 called What Are Universities For? And you can read in this quote that no matter how we try to frame it, in reality, he argues, impact is not a sensible attempt to demonstrate that our research has social value. It's another installment in the attempt to prioritize non-intellectual criteria. So he's expressing concern for evaluation processes. I should also say in this regard that after you obtain funding from the ESRC, you will have to write what is known as an end-of-award report, a quite detailed explanation of what you have done with that money, the kind of outputs you have produced, also on the impact front. And what Collini is saying here is too much of that evaluation is now guided by non-intellectual criteria with the deliberate intention by the sponsors and governments associated with them of directing future research towards activities that have measurable economic and social outcome. It's a quite powerful quote and synthesis of what some people criticize as the new evolution, new trends in the attitude that sponsors have towards our research plans. So the very first question that I'd like you to discuss with your neighbor, literally 3 minutes, no more, and then a very, very quick reporting back of some of the issues, is how can we respond to this kind of argument? Why do you think in your mind, and based on your experience and your dreams as an early stage academic, why should we value the impact of our research? So please have a short discussion with your neighbors, 2 minutes, and then let's see what comes out of this. Let's see what are some of the thoughts that come through your minds during the discussion in response to this type of argument by Collini. Anyone wants to start? I know that there's also a mic here in case you feel you need one. Very quickly, what I would like is literally a sentence or two at the most, but from different people. Why should we value impact? Yes?
On the one hand, it's important because you're being funded, so it's fair enough for somebody to say, I've given you this wad of cash, what do I get for it? So the one hand, it's you can understand why. But on the other hand, we were saying, what would Foucault say if he was challenged as to what his impact has been? Obviously, his impact has been massive, but how would he quantify that, and how would he present that to the ESRC if he was ESRC?
It's a great answer. Anything to add to this or to respond? Yes, please.
One reason it should be valued is that that will help to prevent the perception and the reality of people sitting in ivory towers stroking beards and counting angels on the heads of pins. It makes a connection between academia and the real world, because often there isn't a connection.
Okay, but should there be? We can ask ourselves. I saw a hand back there somewhere. Yes, please.
Yeah, we said if we're only doing it to sort of answer our own questions and it doesn't benefit anyone else, then it's kind of a bit self-indulgent, whereas it kind of needs to benefit other people and have an impact on their lives as well.
Okay. Yes, we will find some of these answers. Let's move on. We'll obviously come back to all of this. It got me to think, why have I become so involved with the impact agenda? I'll be speaking in Bath tomorrow about something very similar, how to achieve impact at the international policy level. So it got me to think, as I was putting this PowerPoint together, what is it about impact that comes so natural to me? Well, my own answer to Collini's quote would be threefold, really. First of all, I would argue that for me, the impact agenda is intrinsically significant, not instrumentally. I want to achieve impacts and change the world, and that's the reason why I'm an academic. I don't care about the end of a world report, I don't care about the Outstanding Impact Prize, it just comes natural to me. And no research project would ever feel complete for me unless it has changed something in the reality around me. And going back to the Foucault example, which is a very powerful one, the history is obviously full of great intellectuals who have worked on very complex theories. Well, I'm wondering perhaps, and I ask you in a provocative manner, shouldn't we learn, alongside of our theoretical speculations, to actually translate the outcomes of that kind of thinking in an everyday language? Shouldn't Foucault be able to tell his grandmother what his research and thinking are about? So perhaps there are two parallel pathways here. One is our contribution to theory, which for me has always been important as an academic, but also a bit of effort that we need to do to make sure that those theories become at least partially accessible to people in the real world. And the reason why I'm saying this, the reason why I see a responsibility by social scientists to do so, is that I really think we are uniquely positioned to improve the world for one fundamental reason. And you can see this when you interact as often as I do with policymakers and practitioners. You will see, I think, immediately what the difference is with academics. We do have an amazing ability that we are not fully conscious of as social scientists to make connections between issues, between fields, between concepts. We have a very systemic perspective. We constantly raise new questions based on this capacity to think outside of the box. A lot of policymakers, a lot of professionals work in a silo, they think in a silo. Our holistic perspective is really what we can offer to the real world, in my view. And that is the most fundamental reason why we should pursue this agenda. Then, of course, there's an issue that some of you brought up during the discussion. We do rely on public funding for our research. It's not just a question of giving something back to the ESRC that has funded our research. We need to remember that a lot of the funding bodies are actually public, taxpayers' money. Don't we want to actually use that money, at least partially, to try to contribute to the public good, no matter what kind of research topic we are involved in? And I'll tell you what my story was with this very strange project, because now, honestly, to think of social scientists becoming involved with research on school food was really not very well received or seriously taken at the time. For me, it was an accident. I was just here working on another ESRC research project on local food in Wales and elsewhere in Europe. And we came across some Welsh quality food producers who would have liked to access the school food market. It was a very important, reliable market for them to access, and they just couldn't. They found obstacles at every turn, in every possible way. And a colleague of mine asked me, I'm originally from Italy, and I was going back to do some research. So a colleague of mine from the UK asked, is this how it happens in Italy? So I went to Italy and I was doing research on something else, and I decided to explore this issue of why is it so difficult for quality local food producers to access the school food market. What really did the job, what really made a big difference for us was that, the research immediately attracted an enormous amount of attention. I went to Italy as a sort of labor of love, unfunded. I was just intellectually curious to find out whether the situation in Southern Europe was comparable to the UK, and actually it was not. It was the other way around. So we decided to engage in a pilot project, and this is a very strong advice that I want to give you as early stage researchers. Funders like to see some kind of track records in your applications for funding. So if you do have an opportunity to do a little bit of preliminary research before applying for funding, I think it's always a great idea. That's what we did. Labor of love, a small pilot project, and the production of a non-academic report on the issues, non-academic, hence written in a very simple, accessible language, to explain why is it so difficult to enter the school food market for quality food producers in the UK, and it's not at all difficult in countries like Italy. Of course, we also began at the same time, and this is the parallel process that I was trying to explain to you earlier on. At the same time, we began to try to frame these issues in more academic terms. If we wanted to get funding, if we wanted to get respect and attention from people who at the time thought that this was a really crazy topic to research, it was very important to frame it in a way that connected it to larger debates, larger issues. Another key thing to do, especially for you just starting your own research, make sure that you don't get stuck into the very small world of your own field. Try to see how that topic relates to the grand challenges, for example, climate change, biodiversity, and so on. For us, it was clearly sustainable development. What were the obstacles to the design and delivery of sustainable school food systems in a country like the UK? Now, the second question, and this is going to be really even quicker to address, is, okay, who do you think are the non-academic beneficiaries of our research? So moving away from my own example and my own research, or at least keeping it in mind in terms of process, but thinking about your own, who do you think are the ESRC calls them end users of our social science research? Can you have another quick chat for a couple of minutes? So who are the non-academic beneficiaries of our research? This is going to be very quick. The public, yeah, but who? Who in the public? Civil society, you mean? That's the way to put it. Civil society, don't say the public. Too vague. Doesn't mean anything. Who else?
Teachers.
Teachers in your case. Okay, that would be part of the civil society category. Okay, so you write the pathways to impact. This research targets civil society, particularly teachers. Okay, NGOs, it's also part of civil society. What else outside of civil society, folks? Politicians, yes, politicians, very much so. And policymakers, professionals. And let's see, this is really, it's very interesting that you have this focus on civil society users, because if you look at what Sonnino says in his book, when he criticizes the impact agenda, he writes that impact is another metric designed to redirect universities' research in politically approved directions. So the underlying argument here is that there is a policy behind the type of research that gets funded or that acquires relevance and the type that doesn't. When in realities, and this is from my own experience of many, many years of research, there are at least 4 key communities of non-academic beneficiaries of our research. So I really don't understand why such a focus on policymakers. Yes, they are an important potential category, but there are also practitioners and professionals that we could be targeting as an end-user community. Civil society, as you pointed out, and within that, there are, of course, all kinds of subcategories, and the private sector as well, because it's another important player in today's world. So in the case of our own research, when we finished our own pilot project, we had a very good idea, a very good sense of who were the key players here. And we decided to focus on 2 key stakeholders, not necessarily because we thought that that's where the impact lied, but we thought that that's where the problem was with the school food system. First of all, dinner ladies. This is a very disempowered and at the time skilled category of workers. Workers who in a country like the UK at the time had a very low self-esteem. They were often target of jokes. They simply couldn't believe that there were academics coming from Cardiff University to interview them and talk to them. So in a sense, and I can already give you an important answer about impact, one of the most significant impacts of my research for me was that the sense of empowering them. That alone was a great outcome. The other thing that we noticed is that these dinner ladies faced ethical dilemmas that we thought we as academics could contribute to solve. I'll give you one example. When I was doing research on the school food system in New York, in the United States in general, school food is heavily stigmatized, is seen as government's food. Hence, in difficult areas of the city, like in Brooklyn, for example, or East Harlem, kids don't particularly like to be seen eating school food, but they're very poor at the same time. And for many of them, the school meal is actually the only meal of the day. So it was, dinner ladies described this to me, and I actually then saw it with my own eyes. Lunchtime comes, the food is available, it's quite cheap, but these teenagers wouldn't even dare to get close to the counter to order some food. They didn't want their peers to see them doing that. Government food they can do without. And then when they finally closed the kitchen in the afternoon, the same kids would go to the dinner ladies and say, "I'm starving, can you please give me an apple?" So the dinner lady said to me, "What am I supposed to do?" If I continue to give them food for free when they ask for it, I know I'm doing something that is actually very humane and very important from a social perspective, but the system will fall apart financially. What should I do? Well, we really thought that one of the things that academic research can do is to address this kind of practical dilemmas. And a lot of the practicalities, a lot of the problems that we identified had to do with the procurement culture in this country, with procurement officers that seem to be very much trapped in a low-cost catering culture. The only thing that seemed to matter in the UK, like in the United States, was to spend as little public money as possible for an important service like school meals. And they would justify this by telling you that there's something in the EU procurement regulations, in the legislation of the European Union, that forbids the purchasing of things like local organic food. Was that the real reason? Is that true? And what can be done about it? Now, here comes the third and trickier question. I have already given you one possible answer. But can you think, based on your own work and your own experience, what kind of impacts can we achieve through our research? A few minutes, please continue the discussion and then we'll reconvene, yeah?
I think the problem with impact is quite often you have indirect impact. So anything that we're publishing might not in itself be enough to actually create that much of an impact, but it puts ripples into the academic community. Mm-hmm. So as much as you're talking about making impact with non-academics, you can't actually forget that the impact among academics could lead later on to a much bigger impact than what you alone can actually achieve.
It creates a double burden, absolutely, and often a double publication strategy. So I always made sure that I publish the outcome results and findings of my research, and not just in academic journals where I was obviously doing some theoretical elaboration, but also in a type of grey literature that's more accessible to the general public. And that is one problem. But with a view to doing what? What are the possible final outcomes of our efforts here?
It can be just as simple as raising awareness around an issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Raising awareness. I'm going to be frame it slightly differently in the next slide. But the very first type of impact that you achieve is simply by circulating information. A lot of the practitioners, policymakers, civil society organizations, even professionals that you will be working with during your research, as I said, they work in a silo. There's an inertia in the way in which they do things. They do it because that's what they've been taught to do. So they don't know that there may be an alternative way of doing the same thing, of purchasing the food for the school children. So for me, in my specific case, I mean, I use the word empowerment. That's what I think my research has mostly done in my career. But what does that mean in tangible terms? I think I've helped the stakeholders to make informed choices, and this is really the point about knowledge exchange. Keep in mind, and this was one of the most interesting aspects for me of my own experience, that I became, as an academic, I became a vehicle for knowledge exchange, whether I like it or not, because I was doing comparative international research. Everybody wanted to know how they were doing it in other countries. And which was great for me because I traveled to something like 15 countries in 2 years just to say how they were doing it in other countries. But you know, it also showed me how there was a gap, a knowledge deficit there, mechanisms that ensure the circulation of knowledge and best practice examples. The second main impact of my research, I think, was about alleviating fear and uncertainty. I mentioned earlier on that they were all talking about these EU procurement regulations as the biggest obstacle to the design and delivery of sustainable school meal systems. But I discovered, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there was absolutely nothing in the EU regulations that forbids the purchasing of quality ingredients. it was in many ways a manufactured message that some governments were actually bringing down to the ground to make sure that people continue to spend as little as they possibly could on a public service like school food. So a lot of innovators, potential innovators who were working on the ground and could have achieved great things, simply were trapped into this sense of fear, uncertainty, what can be done and what cannot be done. And my research was very instrumental in giving them a clear sense of what the situation was. In doing so, I think I have achieved a third outcome, which is avoiding the isolation of innovators, making sure that innovators, people, visionaries, people who wanted to do things differently, could start a dialogue, encourage each other, share best practice, share lessons. And these are all amazing impacts that I think an academic research project can achieve. So in all, when people ask me, and of course we had to film a big documentary for the ESRC about the impacts of our research. Last week I had a very long interview with BBC Wales that will be shown in May. There will be a new program on food, and they came to my office to interview me for a very long time. Even in dealing with the media, and we'll be talking about this in a second, you have to have a very clear in mind, a very concise manner of describing to the public through the media what kind of impacts you have achieved or you want to achieve. For me, what really mattered was to help stakeholders on the ground to reimagine school meals in a more sustainable manner. And I said this at the interview with BBC. This was a sort of slogan that we coined during our research, and that proved to be extremely powerful to attract the attention of media, of practitioners, something that everybody can understand. And once you hear, you want to know more about it. I said last week to BBC, and I've said it many times during my research, I think school meals should be designed as a health and well-being, not a commercial service. And this was the key finding of our research. The big differences between Italy, for example, and the UK were all in the way in which this service was framed and imagined. Of course, I would say that one key aspect of the research that I already touched upon here, and this is also something that I would strongly encourage you to do if you can. If you are very committed to the impact agenda, one very effective way of carrying that forward is by focusing on best practice examples, because best practice examples are what give people inspiration. Okay? You're going to help policymakers, you're going to be telling positive stories, you're going to show the world that things can be done. So for those of you who have an especial interest in impact, that is a very, very effective way. Now, because we have very few minutes left, and I'd like to leave some room for final questions, I want to go quickly through the mechanisms that are available to us, because you could well say at this point, okay, Roberta, about what do we actually do in practice to make sure that our research generates impact. Well, my very first advice is this. Make sure that your stakeholders, the people you want to affect and have an impact on, are engaged with your research from the very beginning. Don't ever think that you work for 2 years on a topic, ignoring them, and then you come at the end with a lot of findings, a lot of lessons, a lot of messages, and they're going to listen. You also badly need their knowledge, formal and informal. So if you want to understand, and sometimes it takes a long time to understand what the real issue is, beyond words, beyond the rhetoric, beyond what they tell you. So my first advice would be engage with them as soon as possible. In some cases, it may be effective, especially at a later stage in your career, to establish some sort of advisory board. So you have 5, 6, 8, depending on the size of your research, key stakeholders as member of an advisory board that you can communicate with simply by email sometimes. because that is a way of maximizing impact in real time, especially if the focus of your research is policy that changes all the time. You need to be able to have a constant dialogue and have an impact when the time is right for it. An advisory board can also actually stay there after the project is formally ended. So you will guarantee the continuation of impact. And ESRC likes that, to know that they have invested some money, not just for you to finish the work and that's the end of the impact. The impact can go a very long time. We finished our research on school food in 2008, and I still get BBC in my office for 2 hours to talk about it. So it can be done, it should be done. Of course, communication is key. So the advisory board is one important mechanism, but there are other possible tools you can use. A dedicated website, social media, having a Facebook site for your research project, for example. Organize occasionally, and I would recommend to do it at the very beginning of a research project, halfway through, and then at the end, a workshop with the key stakeholders you're trying to engage in the research. So that is another very effective way of making sure that they remain involved in what you're doing. So in all, and this is my very last slide, I think it's a combination of private dialogue and public debate that really produces impacts. I mentioned my traveling. I mean, it really was out of control. The highlight for me, there were several. We were invited, and this is an example of something I mentioned earlier on, we were invited to do a press conference with the mayor of Rome, who's a very well-known politician in Italy, and who was very proud of himself when he learned that there were academics in Cardiff thinking that Rome had the best school meal service in the world. You cannot imagine the resonance of that press conference. The London Times came, obviously is a very, very well-known and visible politician in Italy. I was invited to give a seminar at the Finnish Parliament, with the entire Parliament there, listening to what the potential of school meal service can be in sustainable development terms. But obviously there was nothing like being invited at the United Nations in the spring of 2009 to talk in New York City about our examples of school food reform. And this is another type of impact that you can achieve, bringing a very local issue to a very global level, making sure that something very localized, very circumscribed, actually acquires world resonance. It was a lot of work, I have to confess. It was very, very demanding, very intense. You had to participate, for example, in a lot of advisory boards, because you can expect your stakeholders to be part of your advisory board, or to find time for your interviews, and then they need something from you and you're not available. No. I was sitting in the advisory board of the Scottish Government, in the advisory board of the Soil Association. It never ended. Local and national governments. Sometimes some of these trips seem to be very useless. I would address audiences of up to 600 people at times. In the United States, they invited me to be the opening keynote speaker for the Community Food Security Coalition conference. But don't ever go into an event of that size and magnitude thinking that the audience will come out of that room and everybody will have changed their mind. So sometimes, and I think that I have to confess, when I actually lecture at Cardiff University, if I were to do my teaching under the illusion that every student in that class will learn how to love my topic and my research, I would be a very frustrated human being. I've just learned all it takes is that there are a couple of people who change their attitude and their way of looking at something or their career, and sometimes changing the mind of just one individual can go a very, very long way, also in relation to impact. So thank you very much.